Hey, y'all, welcome again to Niles First Christian Church, Disciples of Christ. My name's Pastor Chris, and we are in the midst of a very quick overview of the Hebrew Scriptures. As Advent is very quickly going to be upon us, we are just covering the very basics of these books in the Hebrew Scriptures. Today, we're hoping to go over a very quick overview of the Torah, of the Pentateuch, of the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. We see in these books a theme of God making contracts with human beings, covenants, promises, agreements of how God will continue to work with these people and what should be expected of these people that follow God. That is really what the essence of the Pentateuch, the Torah, is, those first 5 books. It's about how humanity has decided to work with God or refuses to work with God, and how God continues to make these agreements in a way that benefits humanity as a whole. We see that in the very beginning with those first 2 chapters. As Douglas Adams would tell us, in the beginning, the universe was created. This has made a lot of people very angry and has been widely regarded as a bad move. But of course, we don't see that in those first 2 chapters. We see that God spoke into existence and found these things good, that God worked with those first earth creatures to bring about an abundance, to make things truly good. And as it happened from there, the world became populated, and eventually humans started to rebel or think that they had a better path or knew better than God. God decides then to start from scratch, to say, hey, this isn't working, and to pick one family, the family of Noah, to start again. Again, God makes a covenant with Noah that going forward, floods won't happen again. Noah brings animals on the ark, and whether it was 2 of each animal or whether it was 7 of the domesticated animals is maybe a time for another study, a more in-depth study of that story. But from here, after the beginning and after the rebellion and after the covenant with Noah, God decides to start again with one family that will bring about blessing to the entirety of creation. This is the family of Abraham, and through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who became known as Israel, and through this family to everyone, not just the Hebrews and later the Jews, but all of us, including Gentiles like myself. This covenant was one of promise. It was one that said salvation would come to everyone. And this is what is developed as the book of Genesis. As we get to Exodus, we hear the story of Moses, that the Israelites are now slaves in Egypt. And through the person of Moses, God grants deliverance. This is the story of Moses going up against the Pharaoh with the help of his brother Aaron and his sister Miriam, and them removing themselves from Egypt through the providence of God. This is the story of the plagues and of the retreat through the Red Sea or the Reed Sea, depending on your translation. Of course, even here in this promise of deliverance, the folks that have been delivered think they might know better. They end up wanting to do something different than what God is directing them to do. We know this through the story of the golden calf, and it was enough to make God say, look, here is another covenant. Here's another agreement that we can make with each other. If you all follow these laws which I will lay down, you will find blessings. If you don't follow them, you will not find blessings. It will be difficult for you if you stray from this, because this is your identity now. This is the covenant that is laid down, and this is the law that takes up a large portion of the rest of the Torah. These are laws that explain how to obey God and how to rectify disobedience. It's a a promise of how to worship, and with proper worship, a promise of blessing. This is where we get all these laws that essentially boil down to a covenant between God's people and God. And they boil down to how to obey God. And a lot of it involves rejecting idolatry. So much of the Torah is folks thinking they know better and trying to do their own thing, only to get themselves in a bind or to meet with an outside force, and to recognize that they should have just been following God all the time. So much of this has to do with specifically idolatry. As soon as you start to worship something other than God, you start to lose your identity within the Hebrew scriptures. As soon as you start to worship something else, you become like that something else. But if you worship God, you remain holy. If God is what you fix your sights on, you remain a people that look like God, that reflect God to the outside world. So the story of the Torah, the story of the Hebrew people that we find in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the story of the people who become the Jewish people, is a story of returning to obedience of God and eventually rejecting that obedience and returning then again to obedience to God. So much of these laws that we find in the Hebrew scriptures truly resemble two main goals: to worship God, to solely worship God, to not have any other idols, and to keep identity despite overwhelming outside forces, by seeking to serve each other, by taking care of neighbor. So much of this is a foundation for us as Christians, because we know in Christ, Jesus boiled down these two commands, the entirety of the prophets, and we'll get to the prophets in another session, of the law and of the writings into two main commandments: to love the Lord your God with all your strength and all your mind and all your heart and all your soul, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And this is, if we took more time to study what the specific law demands, you would find that so much of it is about worshiping God in proper ways, about having only God in front of us, and that our actions then as people of God, as worshipers of God, should be met by observing the command to love each other, to serve our neighbors, and that's what it boils down to. What we see in the Torah applies to us today, not necessarily by keeping the mitzvot, not necessarily by keeping the entirety of the law laid out in the Torah, but by recognizing some eternal truths that are found in the Torah. Idolatry is still a major problem amongst people of faith. We see this in the Hebrew scriptures when people started worshiping the nation state rather than the God that set them in this nation state, that brought them to the Holy Land as after they wandered through the wilderness. We tend to treat nationalism as a God as well. We should be careful, because nationalism, in that same sense, is an idol for us today. And we have idols in so many other forms. We can learn from these stories in the Hebrew scriptures to reject idolatry and to only serve God, to be present with each other in ways that benefit the entirety of God's people, and thereby be a blessing for all creation. Now, again, this is just such a simple overview of what the Torah is. And we could spend time and session working over small little bits like we did last week. We spent an entire session, a half hour, just working on Genesis 1 and 2. So this is a very quick overview. But if you have questions about more about what is contained in these stories, if you're curious about the depth that can be plumbed in this very rich history, I would invite you to comment. I'd invite you to ask questions. I'd invite you to come see me after worship or any time in my office hours. But we invite you, as it is called for the people that found foundation in the Torah, that it is necessary to gather, that it is necessary to worship together, that it is necessary to maintain identity together. And these things lead us. This worship of God solely leads us to this identity. And this identity then calls us to go and serve other people. If we take any overarching theme from this and how it applies to our lives today as Christians, it's to love God and to love each other. Let's try it. Go in peace.